There is a limit to what the human body can endure. Doctors can tell you what it is, the temperatures at which the blood thickens, the hours beyond which the organs begin to fail, the caloric deficit past which the muscles consume themselves, the blood loss that tips from survivable to fatal. These limits are real. They are measurable. They have been measured in the most terrible ways in the history of war and disaster and the kind of extreme cold that the Arctic produces without apology or concern for the creatures caught inside it. Jan Baalsrud exceeded every one of these limits, and then he kept going. He was 26 years old in March of 1943, a Norwegian soldier and trained saboteur working with the British Special Operations Executive, the wartime organization that ran resistance operations behind enemy lines across occupied Europe. Norway had been under German occupation since April of 1940, and the Norwegian exile government in London had been cooperating with British intelligence to supply, organize, and support resistance operations inside the country. Jan Baalsrud was one of the people who did that work. In late March of 1943, he was part of a four-man team inserted by boat into the far north of Norway, above the Arctic Circle, in the region of Tromsø. Their mission was to blow up a German air traffic control tower, a significant installation whose destruction would meaningfully disrupt German operations in the region. They had equipment, training, and a contact network that was supposed to support them once they were on the ground. What they did not know was that their contact had already been arrested by the Gestapo. When the four men made contact with what they believed was their local support network, they were walking into a trap. German security forces closed in immediately. There was a brief, violent confrontation. Jan shot and killed a Gestapo officer at close range. In the chaos that followed, he ran. The other 11 men on the broader operation, the crew of the boat that had brought them, the other members of the team, were captured. They were interrogated and executed, every one of them. Jan ran toward the fjord. The water was freezing, several degrees below the temperature at which a person normally loses consciousness and drowns. He jumped anyway, because the alternative was capture, and he knew what capture meant. He swam across the fjord. He climbed out on the other side, numb, soaked, already beginning to suffer the effects of cold that would define the next 2 months of his life, and he ran into the mountains of northern Norway in the middle of an Arctic winter, with German forces searching for him and nothing between him and death except the refusal to stop moving. He had one boot. He had lost the other in the water. He was in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle, in March, with one boot. He kept going. What followed over the next 2 months is one of the most extraordinary individual survival stories in the history of the Second World War. And given that the war produced more extreme human experience than perhaps any event in recorded history, that is a significant statement. Jan moved through the Arctic landscape of northern Norway in conditions that would have killed most people within days. The temperatures in the region in March and April regularly fall to -20, -30 degrees Celsius. The snow is deep and the terrain is steep, and the distances between any kind of shelter or human contact are measured in days of hard travel. He had no proper equipment. He had no food beyond what he could find or receive from the scattered Norwegian civilian population, farmers and fishermen who risked their lives to help him, who knew that sheltering a fugitive in German-occupied Norway was punishable by death and helped him anyway. He was shot in the foot during the initial confrontation at the beginning of the disaster.
a wound he had not fully registered in the chaos of the escape, but which was now becoming a serious problem. He was losing sensation in his feet. The frostbite that had begun in the freezing water of the fjord was advancing. He was in pain that would have been incapacitating in any ordinary context, moving across terrain and in conditions that demanded everything a healthy person had. The snow blindness came next. Prolonged exposure to the reflected ultraviolet light of the Arctic sun off the snow without any eye protection caused a temporary but complete loss of vision. He spent days unable to see, moving by feel and memory and the help of the Norwegians who had taken the extraordinary risk of sheltering him in their homes and outbuildings. He survived an avalanche. The snow that came down the mountain buried him, and he dug himself out with hands that barely functioned, and he kept moving. He spent nights in snow holes he dug himself, in temperatures that should have killed him because there was nowhere else to go, and he refused to stop. The gangrene reached his toes. He could feel, could see when he unwrapped the frostbitten flesh that the rot was spreading. He understood with the clarity of a trained soldier who knew enough field medicine to understand what gangrene meant, that if the dead tissue was not removed, the infection would spread up his leg and kill him. He had no medical help. He had no proper tools. He had a small pocket knife. He cut off his own toes. He did this not once, but multiple times over several sessions, removing the dead and gangrenous tissue with a knife intended for ordinary camp tasks, working on himself in a snow hole or a farmer's barn, or wherever he happened to be when the necessity became undeniable. The accounts of this, both his own account given in interviews after the war and the accounts of the Norwegians who helped him during this period, describe a man who approached this necessity with the same determination he applied to everything else, not without pain, not without the full human awareness of what he was doing to himself, but without allowing the pain to prevent him from doing what needed to be done. He had a companion for a time, a Norwegian resistance fighter who had found him and was helping him move towards safety. But the terrain and the German patrols and the sheer physical difficulty of moving through the Arctic with a man who could barely walk made progress almost impossibly slow. He was passed between families, hidden in barns and outbuildings and snow holes, and eventually in a sleeping bag on an exposed mountainside, because there was nowhere else to put him that was safe enough. There were moments when he lost consciousness. There were moments when the people helping him believed he was dying. There were moments that he, himself, by his own later account, was not entirely sure he was still alive in any meaningful sense. The cold and the pain and the exhaustion producing a state at the edge of consciousness that was not sleep and not death, but something in between, something the body reaches when it has used everything it has and is running on whatever is beneath everything. He did not die.
The rescue of Jan Baalsrud was itself an extraordinary operation, one that required the cooperation and courage of dozens of Norwegian civilians who had no obligation to help him and every reason not to. The German occupation of Norway was not a gentle administration. Helping a known British agent and Norwegian resistance operative was a capital offense. The families who hid him, the fishermen who moved him across open water in small boats while German patrols watched the coast, the men and women who carried him on stretchers across mountain terrain in April snow, all of them risked everything. Some of them were caught. Some were interrogated. The network that kept Jan Baalsrud alive across 62 days in the Arctic wilderness of northern Norway operated at the cost of real danger to the people who ran it. In late May of 1943, Jan was finally carried across the border into neutral Sweden. He had been in the wilderness for 62 days. He had lost most of his toes to frostbite and self-surgery. He had survived temperatures that should have killed him multiple times over. He was severely malnourished, suffering from multiple untreated wounds, and had spent weeks barely conscious on an exposed mountainside, waiting for a rescue that was taking longer than anyone had hoped. He was alive. He recovered in Sweden, slowly, with the medical care that neutral territory made available, and eventually made it back to Britain. He continued to serve in the Norwegian resistance for the remainder of the war. He survived. He went home. He lived until 1988, dying in the Canary Islands at the age of 71. He talked about what had happened over the years with the careful restraint of a man who had learned that the full truth of it was difficult for people who had not been there to absorb completely. He said that the key to his survival was not any extraordinary physical gift. He did not believe he was unusually strong or resilient by nature. He said the key was simpler than that. He had decided not to die. Not in the passive sense of hoping to survive, but in the active sense of treating death as something he was choosing to refuse, moment by moment, in every circumstance that the Arctic and the Germans and his own failing body put in front of him. This is a harder idea to hold on to than it sounds. The will to survive is not uncommon. Most people in danger want to survive. What is rarer is the capacity to translate that desire into action when the action required is almost unbearable, when the cold has taken the sensation from the hands and feet, when the gangrene has reached the toes and the only tool available is a pocketknife, when the snow has buried you and the effort of digging out is greater than anything the muscles seem to have left. At each of those moments, Jan Baalsrud made a choice. He kept making the same choice 62 times in 62 days until the choice was no longer necessary because safety had finally arrived. The Norwegians who helped him have their own place in the story, and it is not a small place. Without them, without the extraordinary network of ordinary people who risked death to shelter and feed and carry a stranger through the Arctic winter, Jan Baalsrud would have died in the snow within the first week. His survival was not a solo act. It was the product of a community that, under occupation, under the constant threat of German reprisal, chose humanity over self-preservation. This is what the occupation of Norway produced, alongside collaboration and fear and all the things that occupations always produce. It produced people who looked at a half-dead Norwegian soldier with frostbitten feet and German patrols in the valley, and decided that the right thing to do was to bring him in, hide him, feed him, and pass him to the next person willing to do the same. Jan Baalsrud's story is a story about the human body's capacity for endurance, but it is also, finally, a story about the human community's capacity for solidarity, for the decision, made under extreme pressure, to help someone who needs help, even when helping is the most dangerous thing you can do. He refused to die. They refused to let him. Both of those refusals, together, are why he survived to tell the story. And the story, 70 years later, still tells us something true about what human beings are capable of, both in their suffering and in their care for each other, when everything else has been stripped away and only the essential choices remain.